Samuel Caldwell, at 67, had become part of the Brooklyn streetscape, an unassuming silhouette beneath a worn olive green rucksack. Its frayed straps whispering of long service and sacrifice. Locals called him the Silent Marine, never panhandling, never causing a stir, only gathering empty bottles by daylight and gratefully accepting a leftover sandwich or thermos of hot tea from compassionate cafe owners. They didn't know that beneath his silver-streaked beard and patched field jacket lay the story of 21 years in the U.S. Marine Corps. Honorably discharged in late 2005. In early 2010, after his wife, Margaret, lost her battle with cancer, a diagnosis delayed by medical missteps, Samuel quietly sold their modest townhouse and slipped into anonymity. It's less agonizing to be nobody than to haunt the life you once shared with someone you loved. He confided to a shelter volunteer one frigid December evening. He'd gone 4 days without a proper meal, and when the mercury dipped below 28 degrees Fahrenheit, he'd slip into a baker's vestibule just to thaw his stiff fingers and steel his heart for another night. Yet, with each shiver and every sleepless hour on a cold marble threshold, his posture remained reminiscent of a platoon sergeant, poised, steadfast, unspokenly proud, in a world quick to equate a man's worth with the tatters of his coat. Samuel's journey reminds us that true courage doesn't shout, it perseveres quietly. One small act of dignity at a time. For those of us who honor service and resilience, his life stands as both a challenge and an inspiration, proof that hope can be reclaimed even in the grayest dawn. Samuel Caldwell's journey began not on the cold streets of Brooklyn but on foreign sands under a scorching sun. Enlisting in the U.S. Marine Corps in the autumn of 1984, he served with unwavering determination for more than 2 decades, completing 3 grueling tours, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, where he oversaw critical logistics convoys that threaded through hostile territory to supply forward operating bases. Samuel earned the Bronze Star for valor after steering a burning fuel truck clear of wounded Marines during an ambush in March 2003. He later received a Purple Heart when shrapnel from an improvised explosive device nicked his leg in Helmand Province. His record shows countless instances of courage, crawling through reduced visibility at midnight to deliver ammunition under mortar fire, coordinating medevac helicopters to extract injured comrades at dawn, and mentoring younger Marines on how to maintain morale when the nights stretched too long and hope ran dangerously thin. After his honorable discharge in December 2005, Samuel returned to New York with the same sense of purpose that had defined his military career. He and Margaret, his college sweetheart turned wife of 15 years, moved into a modest brownstone in Crown Heights. Margaret's gentle laughter and commitment to volunteer work complemented his devotion to duty, forging a partnership grounded in compassion and service. But in early 2010, a devastating twist of fate shattered their world. Margaret was diagnosed with late-stage ovarian cancer, a disease the VA hospital initially misread as a lingering digestive issue. By the time the proper diagnosis arrived, the cancer had metastasized beyond surgical options. Samuel watched helplessly as the hospital's error cost Margaret precious months, or perhaps years, of quality life. Consumed by grief and disillusioned with a system that had failed his wife and himself, Samuel sold their brownstone at a loss. He handed over every dollar to Margaret's favorite charity before disappearing into the city's crowded avenues. I couldn't bear to be someone when the one person I loved most was slipping away, he confided to a caseworker at the Bowery Mission. The man who once mapped supply routes through desert heat now stumbled through sub-zero winters, his military discipline buckling under the weight of loss, though his medals and dress blues remained locked away in a forgotten closet. Samuel's mind replayed every mission, every promise he made in foxholes and helicopters under fire. In that crucible of memory and sorrow, he learned that the bravest battles are sometimes fought in silence, far from medals, far from home, and that true sacrifice often carries a cost far greater than any uniform can reflect. It was a bitter December afternoon when Samuel Caldwell, now 67, slipped into Santos's corner market on Franklin Avenue, his hands trembling from hunger and cold. Outside, the wind chopped at the sidewalks, sending gusts that made his worn field jacket flutter like a ragged banner. Samuel hadn't eaten in 3 days. The last hot meal had been a discarded cafeteria tray he found behind a shelter. As he shuffled down the narrow aisle of the market, he spotted a day-old loaf of Italian bread resting on a low shelf. Its crust was hard, but inside, it promised warmth and sustenance. Heart-pounding, he tucked the loaf under his left arm and eased toward the exit. Head bowed to avoid the clerk's gaze. Just as Samuel reached the door, a security mirror caught movement near the back. Mr. Santos, the owner, had recently installed a monitoring system after late-night break-ins. "Hey," Santos shouted, slamming down his newspaper. "You, stop right there." Samuel froze, the bread cradled in his jacket. He hadn't intended to alarm anyone. All he wanted was the strength to make it through one more night. Within seconds, 2 patrol officers arrived. Officer David Jenkins, the younger of the two, hesitated when he saw the frayed dog tags around Samuel's neck. "You're a veteran, aren't you?" Jenkins asked as he gently clasped the handcuffs around Samuel's thin wrists. Samuel nodded, voice barely above a whisper. "I used to be someone who mattered. Now, I just needed a meal." The older officer, Sergeant Martinez, sighed and read Samuel his rights. To them, this was just another low-level theft, another case to clear before the night shift ended. At the precinct, Samuel's public defender spent mere minutes glancing at his file before scheduling a hearing for the following morning. No one asked about his service record, his Bronze Star, or the Purple Heart he had earned under fire. At first light, he was escorted into the Brooklyn Municipal Courthouse, still wearing the same threadbare coat he'd worn the night before, its lining torn. Sleeves too short, shoulders drooping under the weight of a man who had carried far greater burdens. The courtroom was cold and stark, lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that made every crease in Samuel's face appear deeper. Reporters and lawyers milled about, preoccupied with more sensational cases. When the clerk called case number 47 to 293, City versus Samuel Caldwell, there was little reaction. The prosecutor, a polished young attorney named Mitchell Carr, adjusted his tie and poised his pen. "Your Honor," he began, the defendant was found in possession of stolen property, a loaf of bread valued at under $5. Given his prior citations for petty theft and his lack of fixed address, we recommend continued detention pending trial. Samuel's eyes fell to the floor as murmurs rippled through the gallery. He was a man at the end of his rope, caught trying to stay alive. In that moment, the courtroom embodied everything he had fought to protect, and everything he feared would never defend him in return. When the courtroom doors opened the following morning, Samuel Caldwell shuffled in, still wearing the same tattered field jacket and faded Marine Corps ball cap he'd slept in the night before. His hands were cuffed at his sides, wrists creased and bruised from the precinct's metal clasps. The clerk called case number 47 to 293. City of New York versus Samuel Caldwell, and a hush settled over the gallery. Reporters clicked pens, lawyers whispered behind glossy files. The young prosecutor, Mitchell Carr, rose, cleared his throat, and began. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended stealing a loaf of bread valued at under $6 from Santos's corner market." Carr ticked through Samuel's prior citations for petty shoplifting and noted his lack of any fixed address. In light of these factors, he concluded, "We recommend continued detention pending trial." Samuel's heart pounded, but he spoke only when the judge addressed him. "Mr. Caldwell, how do you plead?" His voice came out steady, though soft. "Guilty, Your Honor. I was hungry." A few of the spectators tittered at the raw simplicity of his statement. One lawyer in the back murmured, "Home again. Poor as ever." Judge Marion Reynolds, a veteran jurist known for swift rulings, glanced down at her file, then paused. She adjusted her reading glasses. Peering at the small print under the fluorescent courtroom lights, Samuel J. Caldwell. Dobb. The 12th of January 1957. Former Staff Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps. The words seemed to reverberate through the room. Her lips parted, and her hand trembled as it brushed the polished wood of the bench. For several long seconds, she said nothing. The bailiff shifted uneasily. The clerk swallowed. In all her years on the bench, judges rarely rose during the arraignment phase. Yet, as Judge Reynolds stood to her full 6-foot stature, the courtroom held its collective breath. Every eye went to the dais. No one moved. Samuel looked up, confusion clouding his features. He'd expected a scolding, perhaps a fine, but never this. Judge Reynolds's face was a mask of controlled emotion, part recognition, part astonishment. After those suspended moments, she cleared her throat, her voice uncharacteristically rough. "We will take a 15-minute recess," she said. "The defendant will remain in custody." Then, before stepping off the bench, she added quietly, "and ensure Mr. Caldwell receives a proper meal." As the courtroom erupted into whispered speculation, Samuel sank into his chair, the weight of his conviction and his past resting heavily on his shoulders. In that charged silence, one truth shimmered. Sometimes, the revelation of a single line, an unremarkable string of letters and numbers in a file, can stop the world in its tracks. That moment in the courtroom felt as if time itself had stopped. Judge Marion Reynolds, a figure of unquestioned authority, leaned forward to scan the file in front of her, only to freeze, her reading glasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. The gallery fell silent. Even the rustle of paper halted. The clerk's monotone voice echoed in the sudden stillness. "Samuel J. Caldwell, former Staff Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps." In that instant, every cold fluorescent light seemed to brighten and sharpen the deep lines etched into Samuel Caldwell's face, lines earned through decades of service, sacrifice, and sorrow. His threadbare field jacket and frayed rucksack, once invisible against the city's backdrop of hardship, starkly contrasted with those 3 simple words on the judge's docket. Judge Reynolds's knuckles paled as she gripped the bench, her posture rigid with shock and recognition. For years, she had presided over a dozen veteran-related cases, but never had one of her own Marines, or the man who once saved her life, walked into her courtroom under suspicion of petty theft. Yet there he sat, wrists still chafed from the precinct's cuffs, quietly accepting responsibility for lifting a loaf of bread in desperation. Now, the same man was revealed to her as the hero who, under relentless fire near Fallujah, had risked everything to deliver supplies and rescue wounded comrades. No gavel fell, no whispered side conversations broke the hush. Even the bailiff stood rooted to the spot, uncertain whether to announce a recess or continue proceedings. Judge Reynolds, usually so composed, simply rose to her full height, and the courtroom rose with her, instinctively honoring both her dignity and the weight of what she had just discovered. It was an unspoken recognition, more potent than any ruling, a reminder that a name isn't merely ink on paper, but a vessel for memory and honor. In that suspended heartbeat, the judge's glassy eyes met Samuel's for the first time. He looked up, startled, as if sensing the sudden shift in the air. Across the room, jurors leaned forward, reporters quieted their pens, and the young prosecutor looked on in constricted disbelief. Then Judge Reynolds spoke, her voice uncharacteristically soft but resolute. "This court will recess for 15 minutes," she said, pausing to gather herself. "Ensure that Mr. Caldwell is neither mistreated nor forgotten." With those words, she acknowledged that justice isn't solely the letter of the law, but also the spirit of gratitude and recognition long overdue. In her chambers, Judge Marion Reynolds sat behind the polished oak desk, heartbeat still racing from the morning's revelation. She removed her reading glasses, staring at the aged photograph before her, a younger version of herself in desert fatigues, flanked by Marines sheltering beneath a field tent. There, in the back row, stood Samuel Caldwell, his jaw set, eyes steady, carrying a wounded medic across open ground under withering fire. She traced the faded edges of the print, fingertips trembling. Summoning her composure, Judge Reynolds activated the secure terminal on her desk and accessed the Veterans Affairs database, privileged information tied to her role on the court's Veterans Liaison Committee. Within moments, Samuel's complete service record flickered on the screen. 3 deployments. 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. A Bronze Star awarded for valor during a convoy ambush in March 2003. A Purple Heart earned when shrapnel severed ligaments in his left leg. She leaned forward, pressing the photo and the digital file together to confirm every detail matched. Her next call was to Colonel David Mason, the former commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. The line clicked 3 times before his familiar, gravelly tone answered, "Marion, is everything all right?" "Colonel," she began, voice taut with urgency. "I believe Samuel Caldwell, the defendant we just arraigned, was the staff sergeant who saved my life in Fallujah. I need confirmation, and I need it immediately." There was a silence. Then Colonel Mason's grave response, "You're right. He's the one. He pulled me, wounded, across 2 miles of hostile territory. Don't let him leave the courthouse." Judge Reynolds instructed, rising to her feet. "I'm calling a recess." Moments later, the courthouse doors reopened to admit 3 uniformed Marines, Colonel Mason, Master Sergeant Angela Torres, and Corporal James Whitfield, who cradled a gleaming wooden case. The gallery stirred as Judge Reynolds returned to the bench without her robes. Just herself, an indebted survivor turned jurist. The bailiff pounded the gavel once, then dropped it, silent in reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Reynolds announced, her voice clear throughout the hushed courtroom, "I have a personal connection to this case before we proceed. The staff sergeant seated before you is the same Marine who, during an ambush in April 2003, risked his life to drag me to safety. I am forever in his debt." A collective gasp swept the room. Still in handcuffs, Samuel straightened at the bench, eyes wide with disbelief. Colonel Mason stepped forward, lifted the lid of the case, and revealed a medal on deep blue velvet, the Navy Cross, conferred by the Secretary of the Navy for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity. With solemn gravity, Judge Reynolds addressed the prosecutor, "In light of these extraordinary circumstances, does the state wish to continue?" The young assistant district attorney rose, voice unsteady. "Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges with prejudice." Judge Reynolds nodded, tears glistening at her temples. "Mr. Caldwell, you are free to go." The gavel fell with finality, not as an end, but as the beginning of overdue justice. The hushed courtroom erupted into a swirl of emotion as Judge Marion Reynolds finally brought down her gavel. "All charges against Mr. Caldwell are hereby dismissed with prejudice." A stunned silence held for a heartbeat. Then the gallery rose as one. Jurors, spectators, even the prosecutor, standing not out of obligation but out of genuine respect. Still in handcuffs, Samuel Caldwell blinked against the sudden glare of realization. He was free. Moments later, Master Sergeant Angela Torres approached, gently removing the cuffs from Samuel's wrists. She helped him to his feet with a steady hand, and Colonel David Mason presented a thick folder containing official orders. Samuel's service-connected disability rating was being upgraded to 100%, retroactive to his 2005 discharge date. The paperwork detailed a back payment exceeding $250, past due compensation that would secure Samuel's medical care, housing allowance, and education benefits. Tears welled in Samuel's eyes as he realized the full gravity of what he had almost lost and what he now stood to regain. Outside the courtroom, news cameras whirred to life. Reporters flocked around Samuel as he stepped onto the marble steps of Brooklyn Municipal Court, Colonel Mason and Judge Reynolds flanking him in civilian attire. Flashbulbs popped as Samuel, dressed in a crisp navy blazer lent by the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance, spoke softly into the microphones. "I never sought charity or pity, only the basic dignity we all deserve. Today, I feel seen. Within 48 hours, a grassroots fund established by local veterans organizations soared past $300 in donations, earmarked to aid homeless veterans navigating bureaucratic red tape. City council members cited Samuel's case when unveiling new legislation to expedite VA benefit claims and provide pro bono legal assistance for former service members. A bronze plaque inscribed, "Justice Remembers Those Once Forgotten," was commissioned and installed on the courthouse lawn. Samuel stood in full dress uniform 6 months later at Fort Hamilton's annual Veterans Day ceremony. The afternoon sun gleamed off his Navy Cross and Purple Heart medals, long misplaced but now polished and pinned proudly to his chest. As he finished his brief remarks, "This country once left me behind. Today it brought me home." The assembled crowd rose in silent salute, young recruits and aging veterans alike standing shoulder to shoulder. Back in Brooklyn, Samuel moved into Veterans Village. In this supportive housing community, he kept only a few possessions: the faded photograph of him carrying a wounded comrade, Margaret's locket, and a small wooden box containing letters from friends and fellow Marines. Each afternoon, he walked to Prospect Park and sat on a bench where you once sought shelter, watching children play with a quiet smile. From anonymous despair to honored defender, his journey became a living testament that proper justice may be delayed, but never denied. 6 months after his courtroom vindication, Samuel Caldwell stood in the lobby of Veterans Village, an airy, brick-clad complex on the edge of Prospect Park designed especially for formerly homeless service members. His new one-bedroom apartment measured just under 500 square feet. But to Samuel it felt as vast as any barracks he'd ever known. The walls were unadorned except for 3 items: a framed photograph of him carrying a wounded comrade beneath a desert sky, Margaret's silver locket, now tarnish-free, and a bronze Navy Cross, gleaming against navy blue velvet. Every morning, Samuel brewed a cup of coffee, American roast, of course, in his compact kitchen before heading downstairs to the community room for breakfast. There, he joined fellow veterans over oatmeal and scrambled eggs, sharing quiet nods rather than pity. By 9 o'clock, he would be at the park bench where you once huddled through February's single-digit temperatures. Now, he sat upright on a newly installed teak bench, watching children chase ducks by the lake. A small brass plaque on the bench read, "Justice Remembers Those Once Forgotten." In October, city officials dedicated a relief sculpture on the courthouse steps, a bas-relief of Samuel carrying the medic, the stars and stripes fluttering behind them. Next to it, the mayor unveiled the Grady Initiative, an annual fund of $100 seeded by local philanthropists to provide pro bono legal aid and emergency shelter to veterans in crisis. Local news helicopters hovered overhead, but Samuel kept his gaze low. He'd learned long ago that real service happens out of the spotlight. That November, on Veterans Day, he returned to Fort Hamilton in full-dress uniform for the first time since 2005. Amid countless gray-haired retirees and fresh-faced recruits, Samuel stepped to the podium. "I once protected this country," he began, voice steady through the microphone. "And today, this country protects me." A hush fell over the crowd of nearly 2,000 assembled on the parade ground. As he spoke of resilience, sacrifice, and the need for enduring compassion, even the autumn wind seemed to pause in respect. Back at Veterans Village, Samuel became a mentor to younger veterans navigating bureaucracy and trauma. Each Thursday evening, he hosted Coffee and Counsel, sharing tips on filling out VA forms, advocating for benefits, and rebuilding one's life after service. He rarely mentioned his hardships, and never complained, yet those who attended knew his advice came from decades of hard-won experience. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, Samuel would stroll to the mossy stone where you once slept, now a quiet corner of the park. He'd pause, place a hand on the backrest, and whisper, "No one left behind." In that simple act, he honored both those still forgotten and those who had finally reclaimed their dignity, and reminded every passerby that justice though delayed, can arrive when we refuse to look away. When Samuel Caldwell's story reached its 12th month in the public eye, its ripples had become a tide of change across New York and beyond. Grassroots veterans groups reported a surge in requests for legal aid as the Caldwell Coalition formed to lobby state legislators for faster processing of Department of Veterans Affairs benefits. What began as a single online petition grew into a 50,000 signer movement calling for the Veteran Fairness Act, a bill that now awaits committee hearings in Albany. In Brooklyn, the courthouse steps where Samuel first stood cuffed were transformed into a living memorial. A bronze bas-relief depicting him carrying a wounded comrade was unveiled in a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by city officials, service members, and neighbors who once passed him by without a second glance. Adjacent to the relief, a granite bench engraved with the quote, "No one left behind," invites passers-by to pause and reflect on the debt owed to those who served. Philanthropists seeded the Caldwell Initiative with a $100 endowment to fund pro bono attorneys specifically for homeless veterans. Within 6 months, local law firms had logged over 1.200 hours of free counsel, helping more than 300 former service members secure housing stipends and disability ratings. On Veterans Day, Samuel himself returned to Fort Hamilton in full-dress blues for a ceremony broadcast on WNYC, where he was introduced as both hero and advocate. His brief address, "I protected this nation, and now it protects me," was met with a 4-minute salute from recruits and retirees alike. At Crown Heights and Cobble Hill community centers, weekly Samuel's Table gatherings bring together older veterans and volunteers for hot meals and peer support, a direct outgrowth of the compassion that once saved him in a grocery store. High school history classes across the city now include his name alongside figures like Audie Murphy and Chesty Puller, examining how one man's quiet perseverance exposed systemic failures and inspired policy reform. Even the Metropolitan Transportation Authority dedicated a subway card this spring, numbered 17,066 in honor of Samuel's age and enlistment year, adorned with excerpts from his letters home, reminding commuters that behind every uniform is a human story. In the wake of Samuel Caldwell's journey, New York has learned that justice delayed need not be justice denied, and that the legacy of one forgotten veteran can light a path toward lasting change for many. Samuel Caldwell's journey reminds us that even the quietest sacrifices can echo far beyond a lifetime. From a sleepless night spent huddled in Prospect Park to the hushed gasp in a Brooklyn courtroom, his story wove together service, loss, and a community's long overdue recognition. Samuel didn't seek medals or headlines, he simply did what needed doing. Whether steering a burning convoy under mortar fire or slipping into a corner market for a loaf of bread. Yet that same humility ultimately compelled a judge to stand, a city to legislate, and thousands of strangers to open their hearts and wallets. Today, Samuel lives in a warm apartment he calls home, mentors fellow veterans through weekly gatherings, and watches children play at the park bench where he once sought refuge. The bronze plaque inscribed, "No one left behind," now marks more than a memorial, a promise carried forward by every life he's touched. Life lesson and call to action. Sometimes the world overlooks the heroes walking among us, until we take a moment to see. True courage isn't measured by medals alone, but by the compassion we extend when someone is down. If Samuel's story moved you, share your experience of unexpected kindness or perseverance in the comments below. Your voice could inspire someone who needs to hear they are not forgotten. And if you believe every life deserves dignity and respect, tap subscribe now and join us for more heartfelt stories that prove justice may be delayed, but it is never denied.